Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Navigating Remote Damage Assessments and Lessons Learned. I'm Jessie Peshman, and I'm Humanitarian GIS and Data Protection Lead at HOT. I lead HOT's Conflict and Displacement Program, and my background is in GIS across public and humanitarian sectors. And yeah, thank you for joining us. Today, we're diving into a crucial topic for humanitarian response, how remote sensing and crowdsourcing mapping can help us understand building damage in crisis settings, and why coordinated methodologies are more important than ever. This conversation builds on insights from HOT's September Lebanon report, which we will link in the chat, which examines why satellite-derived damage assessments often vary, how the absence of a shared methodology can lead to duplication or conflicting results, and what this means for producing reliable, actionable damage data during emergencies. We'll also explore the growing field of crowdsourcing mapping, looking at the earthquake in Myanmar earlier this year and lessons learned for that, and why open collaborative approaches are key to improving accuracy, trust, and decision-making in crisis response. And we're really excited to have you here, and I'm excited to be joined by two fellow speakers. Our first speaker is Saeed, a geospatial architect and information management strategist with 15 years of experience leading high-impact data operations for the UN and other global partners. Saeed has designed critical technical infrastructure and led the rapid post-disaster data systems after the Beirut port explosion of, 5 years ago now. He's a voting member and a member of HOT's board, an advisor to Civ API. And then I'll go, and then we have Bernard, who is a program specialist for Asia Pacific here at HOT. Bernard brings extensive experience in sustainable development, having worked with UN Habitat on integrating sustainable planning into humanitarian contexts and with the Foreign Service. He's a strong advocate for meaningful participation and is passionate about OpenStreetMap, and he will be talking about the Myanmar earthquake. So we will start with Saeed to talk about why this topic is so important and for our introduction. So over to you, Saeed.
Thank you, Jessie. Good morning to you and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Saeed Abu Kharoub, and I speak to you today wearing two hats. First one as a previous local consultant for HOT in Lebanon, and now as a board member for the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team. The global conflict events nearly doubled over the past 5 years. This makes it reliable, rapid information on infrastructure damage absolutely critical for aid delivery and recovery planning. Remote damage assessments using satellite imagery are one of the top 3 satellite applications for humanitarians because they are safe and effective for estimating impacts where ground access is limited. On the September 2025 report on Lebanon, a guide to remote sensing analysis for conflict damage, investigated the numerous assessments done in late 2024. The core finding is alarming. Estimates of damaged buildings in Bint Jbeil district differed by up to a factor of 3. The highest estimate was 14,916 damaged structures, figure given by Mercy Corps, compared to the lowest figure, which is 4,796, given by Oregon State University. This is not just a technical footnote. This is a massive divergence, and it challenges confidence, confuses the decision makers, and it misdirects resources based on inaccurate estimates. On the discrepancy, basically, there are 2 pillars. The first pillar is the methodological divide. The wide spectrum of results is driven by differences in the remote sensing techniques and parameters used. The first point is the high counts. The organizations with the high estimates used SAR, backscatter differencing. SAR uses radar signals and penetrates clouds and darkness. They also often used rank classification, for example, severely and partially damaged buildings. On the low counts, the more conservative assessments using methods like INSAR, coherent change detection, which measures phase differences, or expert visual interpretation of optical imagery. These often used a simple binary classification, whether it is damaged or destroyed. The key insight, different definitions of damaged and different sensors led to different counts, even though all were assessing conflict damage. The second pillar is the critical data baseline, the OpenStreetMap gap. The most important input in the pre-conflict baseline building footprint dataset, without a complete map, you can't count what was lost. Most early 2024 assessments used Microsoft building footprints. However, a major crowdsourced effort done by a Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team volunteers to update the building footprints in conflict-affected areas, and it was completed by March 2025. As a result for this, in Lebanon, southernmost districts, the OpenStreetMap dataset had 65% more buildings than the previously leading Microsoft dataset. As an implication for this, initial rapid assessments may have overlooked damage in up to 65% of the buildings that were simply absent from the map. Moving forward, there are several recommendations that we want to have in place, titled by transparency and coordination. The first recommendation is full transparency and open access. We need full transparency from data producers, data suppliers, on the methodology and the limitations. Basically, it is not recommended to have single damage assessment to be treated as a fully accurate. There should be several damage assessments being conducted. Users must review limitations and consider the context of each findings. We must promote open access to damage data, even if aggregated, to avoid unnecessary duplication. Second recommendation is coordination. I will title it as coordination over duplication. We need dedicated resources to research the complementary strengths across different approaches and harmonize analysis. We want to use the right tool at the right time, starting with start of the conflict, first as advocacy, rapid assessments, SAR-based automated, provide the general estimates and support advocacy-oriented messaging. Second, response, programmatic. Optical manual inspection is better for identified areas of need. And the third point is recovery and the operational contexts. Assessments for aid delivery must come from ground truth and verified surveys. This is the minimum necessary to maximize the effect resource allocation. Continuing with the recommendations, the third recommendation is to invest in quality open footprints. Lebanon case is a definitive argument for investing in OpenStreetMap communities and also in establishing a local OSM chapter. Crowdsourcing ensures timely, comprehensive, and human-in-the-loop building footprints are available for use by all damage assessments. This gives everyone the same reliable starting map. As a summary on the report, basically, we call for a better coordination, better research, and better data. In times of reduced humanitarian resources, we need complementary and coordinated analysis. To avoid misinterpretation and confusion, we must establish best practices for when to use specific methodologies and increase the use of accepted and vetted damage analysis. The work of a humanitarian OpenStreetMap team is to provide the reliable foundation, the map, so that your analysis, your advocacy, and your aid delivery can be accurate and impactful as possible. Thank you, and I will now hand it over back to Jesse, who will provide deeper technical dive into specific methodologies discussed in the Lebanon report. Over.
Thank you, Saeed. Let's see, last time. There we go. So as Saeed was saying, there was a lot of different damage assessments in Lebanon, and I'm going to walk you guys a little bit more in detail through the journey we went through. When the conflict increased about a year ago now, we had a lot of requests for helping navigate how to understand where things are destroyed or damaged to help inform response to the humanitarian situation there. And that led us on a whole report, which we'll link in the chat if it hasn't already, looking at that landscape of what damage assessments were published in Lebanon for the same period, which was a year ago. So damage due to the conflict with Israel by the end of 2024. So more recently, I did what a lot of people I think are doing these days. I asked ChatGPT to try and kind of simulate taking that question of how many buildings are damaged in Lebanon by the end of 2024. As Saeed was saying, the numbers really varied by a factor of 3. So on the lower end, we ChatGPT also said around 5,000, and UNDP had almost 18,000. So I'm curious, either think about what question you or what answer you would use or put in the chat. Would you go, if you were writing a report or doing a presentation, or you're an analyst and someone at your organization asked you, can you get a statistic for damage numbers, and you only had 60 seconds to decide, which one would you do? Would you go with the lower one or the higher one? It's a little practice. So there was way more than 3 different numbers. We found at least 9 damage assessments for that same period last year for conflict damage in southern Lebanon. HOT was not one of these. There was already a lot of people, a lot of organizations mapping damage. And as Saeed was mentioning, OpenStreetMap data was used, the building footprints, we'll get to that later, but HOT did not map damage. So where do you start? If you have more than 60 seconds to interpret a ChatGPT question, how do you determine which one of these reports do you want to cite? We got deeper into that question by comparing actual building counts and numbers. Of those 9, we only found 5 of the reports that actually shared direct building counts that were damaged. And so we looked at Beit Jabal, right in the southern border of Lebanon, and this kind of tracks with what ChatGPT said, that there was still that factor of 3, that 5,000 to 15,000, but we're getting a little bit more detailed. Now we know that we're all looking at Beit Jabal. We pulled those numbers for that, but we still don't know, do we want to go high? Do we want to go low? There's political and operational reasons that you might want to go high or low, but if you're still trying to find the most accurate, we'll take that assumption. What is actually the truth? How do you determine that? To start that question, to start the answer to that question, you need to know why it's different. So there's different inputs. There's multiple data sets that go into determining damage, whether that's your aerial imagery, your reference data, other information. Those data sets are going to be different. And if it's different at the beginning, it will be different at the end. There's also different methods. There's a lot of different ways. Some are manual, some are automated, multiple different ways within those. It's not all the same, even with manual. And then there's different algorithms. Those are also going to be wildly different and produce different results. And then there's different definitions. So there's different ways to define damage. Are you including destroyed? Are you including moderate damage? What's your timeline? What's your geographic area? All those things are going to make different numbers of damage data for different estimates and different data results. So getting a little bit deeper into this, there are 2 different types of aerial imagery that are used for damage assessments. One of them is optical. I'll start on the right, where an optical image includes the visible light spectrum, so RGB color. These are images I think probably everyone on this webinar has seen. Looking at your base map at OpenStreetMap or Google Maps or any map platform you use, that's a true color image. We're used to seeing those. We're used to, as humans, interpreting those. We see green space, we see a tree, we know it, we see a building, we know it. So that is used for damage, and I'll get into the details on the next few slides. Radar is on the other end of the electromagnetic spectrum with waves, going back to our science backgrounds, and that radar or microwave, those waves are longer, so we can't see them as humans, but we can measure how they interact with the environment, so that's the natural environment or the built environment, and different signatures and ways of processing those radar waves lead to damage detection in a very different way. So to get a little more into that, optical imagery, you can use that for manual interpretation, which I think a lot of people in this audience have done or are familiar with. It's similar to OpenStreetMap mapping in the way you're looking at an aerial image and you're interpreting it, with your own knowledge and context to say, okay, that's a building and that roof looks damaged. Ideally, you're looking before and after event photos, but it's kind of that way is limited. But first I'll talk about, there's also deep learning, and that's more automated methods where it's image classification that an algorithm will detect a signature that identifies damage. And again, it's better if you have a before and after. Now I'll get to the limitations of this kind. Optical imagery, if probably you've looked at this, you know that clouds, resolution, trees, all of that can physically block what you're trying to look at. The other thing about optical that I think a lot of people miss is it's only from the top, or sometimes it's oblique, but it's always just one side. So if there's damage on another side, you won't see it. So I think while this is a great method to actually, physically check something in a way that our brains understand, it just can't capture all damage. So for radar data, you can't manually look at it. It's a lot of little tiny points. And the way that radar works is it takes a signal from a satellite and it goes down to the environment and it'll bounce back. And that wave, because it's so long, the way it bounces back from different substances or different textures, so a tree or a smooth parking lot will look different. So damage will look different than it did before. So you take a before and after SAR signature. SAR stands for synthetic aperture radar, and you can tell what has been damaged based on change. And SAR actually does get that full angles. It can go all angles because it's a bunch of different waves bouncing back. It can see through different weather. It can see through trees. And read the report if you want to know a little bit more, or reach out. There's different ways of measuring that wave bouncing back, but we won't get into that today. But it is really important to know what you're looking at within those, because there's a huge variation in how you're measuring SAR. And it's important to make sure, that you're reading a little bit into the numbers with that, because while I think it's a really powerful approach, it can also be different. So very quick summary of these different methods. That optical, it's very transparent. I think that's one of its biggest strengths. If you have the imagery, which is not always true, especially in conflict zones, then anyone can do it. SAR, on the other hand, the European Space Agency runs the Sentinel program, and that is open data, but you just need a little bit more expertise. You need to know how to manage SAR data and do that analysis. But the data is open. You can access it, and it can see it from all sides. So getting into a little bit of how building footprints are used, because building footprints are used across the board. I don't think I've ever deeply looked into a damage assessment that didn't use building footprints, and it's to make sure that you're detecting damage where there's actually a building or where there was a building. So sometimes that's automated. You're actually doing a spatial overlay for my GS colleagues on the call, or it's manual reference to see if there was a building. So Said was saying, if those data sets are missing buildings, then you will likely miss damage. So kind of pulling this all together And it gets complex really fast, as I'm sure you can guess. Any analyst that's doing a damage assessment is going to make a lot of different decisions by themselves or with a team, starting with what building footprint data set you're using. And Microsoft and OpenStreetMap, as we've established, I mean, they can differ by up to 65%. So starting at the beginning, it can be very different. And here's just a little diagram that's in the report of which organization made which decision. So most use Microsoft because at the beginning of the conflict, OSM wasn't complete, and then we did a dedicated effort. It was, so some did go back and switch out those building data sets. After you decide on the building footprints, then you decide if you're going to use SAR or radar or optical, true color imagery. And then within those, there's two different each types of methods, and those all have very different results. You decide that, and then it depends on your workflow, but you're then also deciding which type of definition. What are you considering damage? Is what, and it also depends on what you can detect. You might not be able to detect a broken window in an optical analysis, so you might not want to even look at moderate damage. So all of these can really influence very different numbers. So it's really important. So what do we do about that, right? There's all these different numbers. There's a lot of increased interest in remote damage assessments. How do we move forward? I really think it's first, if you're citing or using a damage assessment, make sure that you're really reading the report and knowing what the coverage area is. I won't go back to that ChatGPT slide, but if you remember, actually none of it specified what they were counting as damage or what area. So you need to kind of drill deeper. I think foundationally, transparency and the fair data principles, if you're familiar with those, so findable, accessible, interruptible. If you're producing damage data, it's really important to be transparent on your methodology. So to say what data set you're using, it's best practice if it's reproducible by another organization, and what the limitations of your damage assessments are. I think anyone who's run a data analysis, damage or not, knows that there's always going to be confidence intervals and different types of limitations and opportunities. And it's really important to help and just take that time for a couple sentences to say, this is where it came from, this is where it should be used for, and this is what it should not be used for. And because there's so many, I mean, thinking back to that slide of 9 different assessments, we also think it's really important as a humanitarian sector to increase the use of accepted vetted damage analyses. So that means that we should be really paying attention to the ones that come from expert space, that we understand, that we trust, and be making sure that we're citing those and helping those get visibility, so we're all kind of circulating around trusted methods. So I think there's one question that I can really answer, or should we move on to the next? I can see it now. So Sarah's asked, can you talk about the different methods and what the outputs show, damage, building count, levels of damage highs, and compared to what you say cases they confirm? Yeah, Sarah, that's a great question. So the more quicker assessment, so a manual assessment is going to take a very long time. It's going to take at least 3 months, depending on the area. If you're running automated assessments, those are great for just advocacy of kind of a quick and dirty. Is it 10% of the buildings are damaged? Is it 75%? I think that's best used for advocacy, resource alignment, just kind of attention to a crisis. And then as you get more detailed, so taking that time to look at multiple different types of damage assessments, which Bernard will get more into. But when you're at the more building level or block level, that's where that can inform operations, aid delivery, looking to see what streets are maybe blocked, what streets are not. Yeah, maybe I'll type a little bit more in the chat when I think more about that one. Okay, Bernard, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jessie. I hope you all can hear me well. Happy to be able to present. Sorry, let me just. Okay, sorry. Happy to be able to share a little more about what HOT and MyOSM, Myanmar OpenStreetMap Community, how we supported the Myanmar earthquake responses starting March 2025. Next slide, please. So I'm actually quite proud to share that since 31st March, since our activations in collaboration with MyOSM, CD Myanmar, and our global and local pool of volunteers, we have mapped more than 1.7 million buildings with the support of more than 3,400 contributors. We also mapped more than 20,000 kilometers of roads, and this extensive amount of data produced is available on OpenStreetMap and HDX, and went on to support some of the humanitarian sector's response and recovery efforts. Next, please. And I'm here today to talk a little more about our pilot crowdsourced damage assessment methodology, or CDA. And CDA relies a lot on open source too, in line with what HOT has been working with for the past years, including MapSwipe, HOT Tasking Manager, and Map Roulette. And the point is, we wanted to make this as accessible as possible to involve as many volunteer mappers as possible. And we make use of the open source tools that's available on your browser, on your mobile, to be able to let some of the mappers from Myanmar to be able to participate. And on the screen itself, you can see the entire workflow. We started with basic foundational geospatial data mapping. So we work with MapSwipe and HOT Tasking Manager to quickly improve the available OSM data on the ground itself. And we focus on building footprints and road networks data. Once we have this base set of data itself, we then shift into damage assessment. And we use MapSwipe to, we work with a group of Myanmar OpenStreetMap community members to use MapSwipe to identify areas that might have damaged buildings. From there itself, we shifted into HOT Tasking Manager to zoom down to the building level and identify whether or not there are signs of damages. And if there are, the mappers will go ahead to tag the buildings as damaged, and it will be validated by other mappers through Map Roulette itself. And throughout the process, I wanted to also share with all of you that there is a lot of validation mechanisms put in place throughout the entire methodology. The objective is to ensure that the data that comes out is as accurate and reliable as possible. And underpinning all of this is the importance of the involvement of local mappers and their local knowledge. Next slide. And I spoke a lot about MyOSM. Effectively, they are a network of local mappers from Myanmar. And they have a lot of local knowledge, which I'll share a little more with all of you on how it was employed for the damage assessment. But their local knowledge was critical in ensuring that we were able to validate some of the data or invalidate some of the data. And the data that comes out then becomes a much more accurate thanks to them. One thing that we also sought to work on during this entire project was to ensure that we also introduce further capacity building programs to a batch of 15 MyOSM members, with the objective of having them graduate as open mapping champions that could go on to support Myanmar's mapping needs in the future. Next. I think at this point, I want to share a little more about what we have developed and some of our findings. Next. So through the crowdsourced damage assessment methodology, we identified more than 2,469 damaged buildings across 20 townships, earthquake-affected townships with Myanmar mappers. And at this point, I wanted to stress that this is one of the first instances, one of the first pilots that where damage assessments were conducted with local mappers. And there were quite a number of studies made before, research made before, where crowdsourced damage assessment was conducted with experts. And one of the benefits of this, being able to not only involve local mappers and their local knowledge, but being able to involve more people in the crowdsourced damage assessment, allowed us to reach even more townships than what other methodologies could reach. In this case, as you can see on the top chart itself, we have reached 20 different townships. We have conducted assessments in 20 different townships, as opposed to Microsoft and UNOSAT, which reached to about 7 townships in comparison. Next. Okay, now that we have produced the data itself, right, the next step, given that this is a pilot, is that we wanted to understand the accuracy. We wanted to understand how reliable the CDA methodology is, and how can we improve it to roll out for future disaster responses. So we conducted a series of validation consultation workshops with local Myanmar mappers itself. And during these workshops, they will do 2 things. The first is that they will assess sample damaged buildings from not just CDA, but UNOSAT and Microsoft, and determine if it's actually damaged. Effectively, they are validating it or invalidating it. And once they're done with that, they will move on to the next question, which is, what did they look out for to determine if it's damaged or not damaged? What were the signs that they were looking for? And I'll tell you a little more about this because I thought that the findings were quite exciting. Next. Yes. So I think what stands out immediately across all 3 methodologies is that very high satellite imagery is critical to ensuring higher accuracy. And when we compare some of the townships that were covered by MEXA with who provided a slightly higher resolution post-disaster satellite imagery as compared to Planet, which is slightly lower in resolution, but also face issues with coarser textures and discoloration. We found that MEXA, in areas that were covered by MEXA, our mappers, our participants of the workshop tend to invalidate lesser. Meaning to say, in other words, these areas where the damaged buildings are much more, the damage assessment conducted in the areas covered by MEXA is slightly more accurate. Sorry for that, it's a long day. Next. And then we wanted to dive further to try to understand the differences across all 3 methodologies, which is validated more and therefore slightly more accurate. And we found that comparatively, CDA is a bit more accurate because there are lesser invalidation. At this point, I think building on what Syed and Jesse has shared is that at the end of the day, it's very important that we have multiple methodologies together to ensure that we are able to reference each other and come up with a better understanding and overview of the damages in the area itself. At this point, we cannot safely say that each of the methodology is better than the other. So this statement that I'm going to make right now is quite critical, that the observed widespread validation and invalidation across all 3 methodologies through the workshop itself, meaning to say, it's not so consistent. We get such a range of validated and invalidated. It does indicate that damage assessment has quite a number of complexities and limitations when it's done remotely, be it through CDA, be it by UNOSAT, or even be it by Microsoft's AI models. So it is very important to note that the data set at the end of the day is not error-free, but can help to serve as a robust indicative reference rather than definite ground truth. At the end of the day, field assessment does have more higher accuracy compared to remote sensing, and it's important that we have a combination of 2. Next. So now that I've assessed the accuracy, I've assessed different methodologies, then let's focus a little about the experience of our mappers when they were conducting damage assessments. So one of the things that makes it challenging for our mappers to conduct damage assessment was a combination of poor resolution, coarse imagery textures, and discoloration. And you'll know why later once I cover some of our findings. But this combination of this trio makes it very difficult to see the signs of damages. Next. Another challenge that when it comes to the context of Myanmar is the lack of available open satellite imagery, meaning to say pre-disaster satellite imagery and post-disaster satellite imagery has a huge gap between them. I think between 2021 and 2025. So the time difference meant that there are a lot of structural and urban developments in the area itself. And it's at this point that we realized that local knowledge was actually very critical in being able to say that, hey, this is actually structural changes, and it doesn't seem like it's actually damages from the earthquake itself. Or they could say stuff like, I'm familiar with this neighborhood, and it is massive urban redevelopment, and it's not so much because of the earthquake itself. And for us, it's very then helpful to be able to tap onto the local knowledge, to be able to validate all of the data that's coming through. Next. And this is how we also realized that local knowledge was very critical. When we understood what were the signs that they were looking out for, what were what made them so confident that the building is damaged, we tried to get them to share their feedback itself. We created a series of word cloud through the keywords itself, and then broke it down to different categories. And we realized that the mappers were looking out for architecture changes. Location and context was also very critical. They were talking about color, they were talking about shape and position. And some of the things that they were saying, for example, is that when it comes to the stupa, a religious structure in Myanmar itself, most of the time it's painted gold. And because they couldn't see the reflection in the post-disaster imagery versus the pre-disaster imagery, it is one of the convincing factors that led them to make the decision that this is actually damage. Of course, that's by also referencing other contextual clues. They will also say stuff like, the bricks are usually red in Myanmar itself, or at least in this area. And you can see that there's some red marks on the ground itself, which sort of indicates that the ground, the bricks might have collapsed, the wall might have collapsed. And this is another sign that we looked out for to confidently say that this building is damaged. So at the end of the day, I think this was a very exciting pilot for us because it's, again, one of the first times that we are working with local mappers and being able to tap onto their local knowledge itself. And I want to hand this over to Jessie to talk a little more about how we can combine different methodologies.
Yeah, thank you, Bernard. So as you've heard, we've looked a lot into how to best support OpenStreetMap data users navigating areas that we know have been damaged from a conflict or from a natural disaster, and kind of pulling all this work together over the last year. We have three kind of takeaways before we get to the Q&A. Very high resolution imagery is needed for optical and manual interpretation. I think deep learning as well, but you're speaking from hot side where crowdsourcing is something we really value. We also really need to recognize that it might not make sense to do that if there's not high resolution imagery, and that's important to keep the pressure on satellite imagery providers, use drones when we can, to then responsibly map damage, like if we know that is what we need. Even on top of that, if you have high resolution imagery, multiple lines of evidence are always going to be needed. Even if we feel fairly confident that we have identified every damage in an area that is visible on a true color image, we probably will miss some things due to that angle of the optical imagery. So it's really important to either have a ground survey, which is many times not possible, using radar, working with people who have a different method to not only have a more complete view of damage in an area, but also to double check each other. Mistakes happen, there's trends that might be misleading, and you're only going to get that if you're comparing to another type of methodology. You can't use that same methodology to validate. And then thirdly, you really need local knowledge to actually interpret an image for damage. I think we sometimes have an assumption that anyone can see rubble, anyone can see changes in a roof. But as Bernard was showing, it gets really tricky really fast. And you really need someone who knows the area, is familiar with what has changed and the architecture and the crisis to be able to really do that. So those are our takeaways. We really would love to hear from you guys for questions and comments. And thank you. And please put in StreamYard, you can't get off mute, unfortunately, but you can put questions in the chat. So please, questions, comments, feedback, we would love to hear from you. So yeah, type something in the chat. As we pull up questions, please think about any questions or comments or feedback, like you're saying. Okay, another one from Sarah. Hi, Sarah. What is the timeline for the CDA method once a disaster occurs, and how does hot volunteer capacity impact where this can be done? Bernard, do you want to take this one?
Yep. Sorry, still not very familiar with the platform. Thanks a lot, Sarah, for the question itself. The question is actually a little difficult. It really depends on the local capacities that's available in the area that has been struck by disasters. I think in Myanmar itself, for example, it's an area that we do not have often much experience. We do not have much experience conducting open mapping aids, given the current challenges in the country itself. And it took us about a month to share a few capacity building programs on, for example, map swipe, hot tasking manager, how to better map quality data before they were able to fully launch into the CDA methodology. That said, in other contexts where the local mapping community is a bit more familiar with all of the different tools and what open mapping means, it is much more easier to launch into the CDA training itself, to provide them with a series of trainings on how to better identify damaged buildings. What is the CDA methodology, for example, and that could take up to 2 weeks, 1 to 2 weeks. So in essence, if we have local capacities, we can launch CDA within 2 weeks after some training itself. But then that brings me to the second point. Without strong foundational OSM data in the region itself, such as in Myanmar, where we saw more than 85% data gaps at in the earlier days of the disaster, that meant also that we had to take extra time to map out all of the different areas to improve the data before we can launch into damage assessment. So there are quite a few factors that are in place. But obviously, if it's very ideal, if this area is well mapped, if the local mapping community is well skilled, we can launch as soon as 2 weeks itself. I hope that also answers your second question.
Okay, how can a user access the completeness or accuracy of a building footprint data set? Can you talk about building footprint data sets versus building models? Yes, that's a great one, especially because that is more of HOT's expertise. There's different ways to look at building completeness, and it kind of depends on your use. So you can look at just the number of buildings in a data set. If there's more, there is usually an assumption that it's better, but it might not always be. I've seen fragments of buildings that were just like shadows somewhere in the desert that were clearly not a building. Automated methods, I think, have a really long way to go. But if it's generally, and this is just spot checking, once you get to the number comparisons, if you're generally capturing the building area and you're just trying to figure out hotspots of damage, that's probably fine. But if it's not, if it's like grouping a whole block of buildings together, which happens a lot in dense areas, and you really need those individual numbers, that's actually pretty easy to spot by just downloading them, which I know is not great if you're not a GIS practitioner, you don't have it on your machine. I would typically say if you know there's been an OpenStreetMap update, following our channels and our newsletter, that data will be better. That one we do feel pretty confident on. But otherwise, Overture or Microsoft or Google, those are, you kind of just have to use what you want to use. But reach out to Hot if you have any questions about data sets, because we can also help with context specific. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think we've already got that question too. There we go. How can we ensure that ground truth validation feeds back into machine learning models to assess how they perform and improve them? Is there an effort to coordinate this? I would love for there to be. I think that the efforts that have taken place so far have been contained within one organization. For example, I know the World Bank does that approach where they'll do a remote and then they'll go on the ground. That data and that methodology is not fully open, so it's not, others can't access that data or that methodology. It's just the way the World Bank works, and a couple of organizations, I don't mean to call out just them. Hot is working with some academics, and that is some place we would like to move towards, because I actually think that is the number one added value of Hot. And if you can't reach on the ground, in conflict zones or massive disasters, you can't actually get there, but you can have someone who's from that area, and they're just more likely, as we were talking about, to detect damage or to understand it. And I think that's going to be really important for the more academic side of damage mapping. I'm part of the decentralized damage mapping group. I'll get the link and put it in the chat. And that is a big effort to try and coordinate amongst global damage experts. And we're really hoping to get Hot and OpenStreetMap communities more involved in that. So stay tuned, and hopefully we'll have more news on that in 2026.
Maybe I can add one more point.
Yes.
I think one of the biggest takeaways from the Myanmar pilot itself is the strength of the local community's local knowledge. And one of the things that we realize is that getting them to be able to support validation of all the different data sets that have come out is going to be a very strong potential for future, strong opportunity for future training of this kind of AI models, for example. So like Jesse said, I think we are very excited to see how we could tap into that and work with you. Do let us know if you have any contacts, and please reach out to us. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Bernard. Have we tried using... I'm going to take note of that question. I am not a SAR expert. I work with partner organizations, because I don't think I could do that question justice. I apologize. I also, this one, we'll have to take a note of that one. But there was other questions I know. Oh, this is a great question. Are there instances where SAR damage assessments are not possible? This is decreasing. I think Sentinel aims to cover the whole globe. They did have a satellite go down, and for example, Sudan was not covered, but they put up a new one last year, and that gap was closed. So I think there are some gaps in the world, but for the most part, SAR is possible. Whether there's also that pre-conflict or pre-disaster baseline, that's kind of sometimes more of the limiting factor. There's also, and I saw another question that I'll start touching on. It depends as well on the damage signature. So I think a lot of us think a lot about like the earthquake. There was one event, one damage, and that time frame that damage happened. For things like demolitions, ground fighting, things that have a much more prolonged damage, that can be very tricky for SAR to detect. Because you don't know what day that change happened, and it can be small changes on each day. And it's big data, that's getting into big data. So that's when it's not that quick and dirty assessment. But once you get it up and running and you've really spent time, and this is more expert analysis, you can understand your model, and then you can track reoccurring damage, which is something that gets really important in prolonged wars. So that's a great question. Oh, yeah, sorry. Bernard just kind of prompted me. SAR, another complication with SAR in Myanmar, because we talked about Myanmar, was because, and this is just insane, the Earth, it moved so much that it was really hard to get that pre and post comparison. So yeah, there are limitations but it has less to do with coverage. It has more to do with the technical parts. When it works really well, but then it does have all these other complexities. So yeah, it's a good thing to think about that it also has those limitations similar to optical. Is there another question? How do you structure the data and know what attributes are important to capture? Said or Bernard, do you guys want to take this one?
Sorry, yes. When it came to Myanmar earthquakes, we did an extensive, sorry, it's been a long day. We did an extensive study on what the data tags should be when it comes to mapping the damaged buildings. And we realized the first thing is that in the context of Myanmar, not a lot of people are familiar with OpenStreetMap. So we built off what were traditionally used in other disaster responses and tried to localize it to Myanmar itself. And what that meant was that on OpenStreetMap itself, you have the ability to add additional tags to better qualify the data itself. For a building itself, for a road, for example, it could be tertiary, it could be secondary highways. For buildings, we added 4 additional lines. One is damage equal yes, to indicate that the building is damaged. We also added additional details on when the damage were, which was the day of the earthquake itself, what this was based on, which is the satellite imagery that we were referencing. And of course, the name of the disaster itself, I think this was based on GLIDE or GDAC. I think GDAC. So these 4 different tags were added to the OSM data, but it was added in a way that allowed people to still be able to download all of the different OSM data, and then once downloaded, save it out to identify the buildings that are damaged. Because in other contexts where communities might be a bit more familiar with OpenStreetMap data and how to download it, by adding the damage tag in a traditional way, the building disappears. It's considered as destroyed. It's no longer considered a normal building. And if you don't refine your downloading parameters, it might be missed out in your your pool of downloaded data. I hope that helps. Sorry, last thing. For this damage assessment, I saw the word attributes. For this particular damage assessment, we focus on the binary, which is yes, damage, or no, damage, not damaged. We found this to be much more helpful because given the low resolution itself, it's already very hard to quantify what the different levels of damages are. But this is furthermore more difficult given the low resolution imagery that we were working with. Okay.
Yeah, I would say that most remote damage mapping experts I talk to recommend against using any sort of levels of damage. We just don't have the confidence to do that. So what's the next question? How can Sarah sense all sides of a structure? Does this require one scan for a single scene of visual imagery? So again, I'm not a SAR expert, and I'm realizing maybe that would be a nice follow-up webinar. But it has to do with the pathway of the waves and how they're bouncing back. And I do think because satellites do move across space, like they are, it captures it differently. And so, yeah, I think there are resources online with like videos that kind of explain this better, and it would do better than me. I don't know, Sayed or Bernard, if you have any better way to describe how that works, but yeah. Hopefully that helps. Another question. I love your question, Sarah. Yeah, thanks. It is difficult to assess what damage assessment to use for what use case, and that is something that definitely came out of the Lebanon report. And I think, and this is maybe my prompt to talk a little bit more about the humanitarian reset, there's been a lot of working in silos, I'm not going to lie. I think that the organizations that had resources to run a damage assessment, they did it for their need, and they did their own process. And I think there, in the past, was huge potential for that to inform another assessment and to be coordinated. and other parts of the humanitarian sector are coordinated, things like aid delivery, who's, doing what, when, where, that type of things, the 3Ws. But for damage, there actually has not been much coordination at all. And I think it's because it does require that next level of expertise. We're hoping to change that a little bit with a little bit more entry through the crowdsourcing of interpreting aerial imagery in partnership with damage mapping partners to kind of understand that better. But I think big picture, there's less data NIM staff, information management staff across the sector, lots of budget cuts this year. And we started this before those budget cuts. We already knew this was a problem. And I think that now that there's less people doing more, less organizations, it's really important that we coordinate. And it's also really important that we're working with people from the area and who are in the area responding. I think that making sure that there's ownership over this data to make sure it's being connected, and the best way is going to be through people who are from that area, right? So I don't think any international organization can well play that role. But yeah, thank you, Sarah. From Jess, what governance or data sharing mechanism do you propose to know that, what damage data exists and to make it more transparent and accessible? That is a great question. I will now give a shout out to our colleagues at HGX. I think that in anything we do, especially given light of the cuts, we should be using existing resources. And I think the UN has a great data sharing platform. And one thing we didn't talk about today is data protection issues when it comes to damage. We talked a lot about the technical challenges and the differences. And so to responsibly promote that data, aggregating to like a block might be really important. There's a lot of political motivations to under and overestimate damage. So there's different challenges, but HGX can have a share by request. And I think we also need to just kind of rally around like the same types of data sets, similar to, a lot of us are using World Pop, there's kind of these there's different land use cover data sets. We should all be aware of these so that we can also just invest in them and make sure that those are like the frontmost ones. But Said or Bernard, if you guys have any other comments or ideas on that. Okay. Are there any other questions? I know we have like 2 minutes left. These have been great questions. Thank you.
I think, never mind. I'll pass this to you first.
Oh, this looks like a great one for you, Bernard. Is there a way for early career researchers to get involved with HOT? Bernard, over to you.
I think what I particularly love about HOT is our ability to bring together a global community of volunteers. And this is not only mappers, but also validators. And I think there are quite a number of different avenues for you to start collaborating with us, volunteering with us, and being to be able to be on the same working groups. For example, the quality assurance working group allows you to tap into what we are currently working on. And if there are any ideas that are exciting from you, we'll definitely be able to find an opportunity to integrate your expertise, your experiences into our existing projects. So do reach out to us, and we can link you up with the relevant working groups or relevant communities. I hope that helps. I do want to respond to, I'm going to butcher your name, Piwonsky. There was a point that you raised on whether or not the accuracy of levels of damage would depend on the type of damaging event, for example, versus a hurricane versus earthquake itself. And what we found during the Myanmar pilot itself is that preliminarily, our findings does align with previous studies that damage assessment accuracy obviously is dependent on the resolution of the imagery, but it's also dependent on the scale of observable damage. This means that I'll go as far to say that the type of disaster might not matter as much. The being able to see bigger damages on the imagery itself would allow our mappers to more accurately map out all of this kind of damages. But what your question raised was interesting also, in that we realized there are some differences in what we should look out for. What are the signs of damages that we should look out for in different types of disasters? Comparing Myanmar itself, we were looking a lot on the building structures itself. We were looking whether or not the walls have collapsed on the ground itself. Is there any red bricks on the ground? Were there any cracks or damages on the roof itself? Were the building slanted, for example? But recently, we went through some of the examples, still again preliminarily, from the damages of Hurricane Melissa in Jamaica, and the damage is completely different. It's much more extensive. There's a lot of debris scattered all over the area, which then meant that I cannot use debris as a sign of damage because debris is everywhere, even in the vicinity of buildings that might not be damaged. So there are different things that slight differences between different disasters, and it's important that as we train our volunteers to start mapping in different contexts for different disasters, we ensure that our training materials is based on the kind of damages are on the ground. So in Myanmar, what we did was that we went through basic training. We took some of the findings from the first round of damage assessment, and we assessed it together. And we use that as training again, and we continue this cycle until the end of the CDA methodology. And this allows us to continue to improve throughout the entire exercise. I hope that helped.
I know we're at time. I'm typing my email in the chat. So feel free to follow up with me. We covered a lot today, and as you can see, this gets detailed very fast, and that's the challenge, but also opportunity with damage assessments. It doesn't work quite the same as I think other like feature-based mapping that a lot of us are used to. So yeah, I hope that this has been a great introduction for you, and thank you for all the questions. We linked in the chat the report. So yeah, thank you, everybody.